Before we get into today's show, I'd like to take a moment to invite you to share your thoughts and opinions on our work. If you have feedback, ideas, or suggestions relating to any part of our overall platform, we'd love to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We are listening. Your insights help us grow and ensure that we're making the greatest impact possible. To share your thoughts, go to insightmyanmar.org/feedback.
And welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the nature of revolution and the theoretical framework surrounding revolutions and the ways that they are examined in the political space and the academic space. So my guest today has written a pretty detailed article, and we'll try to link the article below in case anybody wants to read it. It's called Myanmar's Redemptive Revolution, Constituent Power and the Struggle for Sovereignty in the Nui Spring Revolution. So before we dive into the details of that, Charlie, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your time and your expertise with us. And I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself for our audience.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come on. My name's Charlie Thame. I am a professor of international relations, assistant professor of international relations at Thammasat University in Bangkok, where I teach political philosophy and international relations theory to kind of undergraduates on our BIR, Bachelor's in International Relations program. My background is sort of in international relations theory. That's what my sort of PhD was in. But from 2011 onwards, I was in MESOT, spent initially a year in MESOT working with an organization there. But then sort of extended to 12 months. And now, sort of 13 years later, I'm still in the region. I spent some time working with Open Universities Australia, providing tutorial assistance to students who are studying social sciences with Australian universities online. Those students were mostly based along the Thai-Myanmar border, between 2012 and 2016. I have been working on research related to political economy and regional integration of mainland Southeast Asia for the last 10 years or so. So special economic zones, migrant worker rights issues, sort of resistance to a lot of those as well. So looking at places like the Delay Special Economic Zone, Chao Kiu, Dilawar, as well as others in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and China as well. So that's a brief introduction.
But yeah, a life filled with a lot of research and a lot of insight. I do also sympathize a lot. I also originally went to Southeast Asia thinking I'll stay for 3 months, and then that extended to 6 months, and then the years dragged on. It just sort of has a way of doing that. So let's sort of look at the article specifically first, and then we can start talking about the different philosophical elements here. So your article is saying something very interesting. So you're talking about the current revolution in Myanmar as a redemptive revolution. And if I've read what you've written here correctly, what you're saying here is it's redemptive because it looks at previous revolutionary, let's say, attempts. In our case, that would be presumably the 4/8 uprising and the Saffron Revolution. And its fundamental goal as a revolutionary movement is to fulfill the promise of those revolutions, or put another way, to finish the work that those revolutions initiated. Is that a fair way of representing the phraseology?
Yeah, in a way, it's a kind of a complicated term. This idea of sort of a redemptive revolution. Where I get it from is from Walter Benjamin. So Walter Benjamin was a sort of poet, critical theorist, a sort of Frankfurt School critical theorist in the beginning of the 20th century Europe. And in one of his theses on the philosophy of history, he talks about revolutions as having redemptive properties in the sense of sort of rescuing a future for future generations. And so that was the sort of initial inspiration for it. But I try and go beyond that in the article. And this idea of redemption kind of plays a variety of different roles. The first one is the one that you're mentioning, right, in the sense that the Spring Revolution from 2021 onwards, it has to be understood as a distinct revolutionary episode in Myanmar's history, but it is the latest in a long line of kind of revolutionary uprisings and struggles to ground Myanmar's political order in principles that would be considered legitimate to most of those who are subject to it. That, of course, includes the 1988 uprising. It includes the Saffron Revolution, but it also includes anti-colonial struggles, the Saffron Rebellion, and ethnic struggles for autonomy, for liberation, and for an inclusive political order for the state of Myanmar. So the Karen, the Kachin, the Shan, and sort of numerous others that we will all be familiar with, and it's too many to sort of mention. So that's the other aspect that term is being used in the article, in the sense that I think that one of the distinguishing characteristics of the Spring Revolution is that, yes, it has to be kind of understood as separate and distinct. And I kind of outline several ways that I believe it to be separate and distinct, not only from these historical struggles inside Myanmar, but also separate and distinct from revolutionary struggles elsewhere in the world over the course of human history. But at the same time, as recognizing that sort of distinctiveness of it, to also acknowledge that it sort of builds on the back of a long history of diverse struggles that I believe, and I think many others would also agree with, that it builds on others, that it's sort of coalescing into a relatively sort of unified movement to sort of finally get rid of the military from Myanmar's political and social order. So I think it's kind of redemptive in the sense that it promises to continue or to complete various different revolutionary uprisings in different parts of the country, from different social groups within the country, that either have been thwarted because the military have had superior firepower, or have been, say, territorially circumscribed in their aims, right? So many of the ethnic rebellions and revolutionary uprisings and ethnic revolutions that are also revolutions haven't necessarily aimed to fundamentally change the political order at the level of the sort of Myanmar nation state. They've instead been territorially circumscribed and been sort of aimed at some securing kind of political autonomy within particular regions of the country. And so that idea of it being redemptive is kind of referring to that sort of aspect, in the sense that it's trying to complete, sublate, to kind of incorporate and to extend and to carry on those previous revolutions that it builds upon. There's another way in that it's redemptive as well. I think that it and this kind of relates to how the revolution relates to other revolutions elsewhere in the world, right? So beyond Myanmar. And I think that one of the points here is that what I see as distinctive in the Spring Revolution is that it kind of comes on the back of two failed revolutions, right? The sort of, and there are numerous kind of failed revolutions, but the ones that I sort of focus on in the paper is the sort of period of 1988 to 1990, which was the sort of uprising in 1988 that eventually kind of failed with the military kind of stepping back in and taking power. And another attempted revolution from above, the so-called passive revolution that could be seen as really sort of taking hold between 2000 and 2011 to 2021, right? The so-called transition period. So that was obviously something that sort of came to pass under the 2008 constitution, but that was an attempt by the military to reshape Myanmar's political order from above. And so this is sometimes referred to in kind of academic literature as a passive revolution, so a revolution that is imposed from above without the participation of the masses, without kind of popular participation, with the aim of kind of restricting access to the state for the kind of people that have claims upon it. And that obviously failed because of the military coup in 2021. Right? The military failed to have its interests protected within an order that it itself had crafted. So that's those two kind of revolutionary episodes in Myanmar, 1988 and 1990, and then onwards from 1990, ultimately to the 2008 constitution and the so-called transition period. Those are two failed revolutionary episodes that people during the Spring Revolution learned from and have overcome. Right? They kind of looked at the sort of failures of 1988. They looked at the failures of transition, and during that sort of first sort of few months of 2021, I think a lot of people were learning the lessons from those. Importantly, one of those is that a strict adherence to non-violence was not going to work against the military, and sort of framing the revolution in ways that doesn't incorporate all of the citizens and all of the peoples of Myanmar also was not going to work. So that's another way in which it's distinct from these two kinds of revolution, right? Passive revolution and the negotiated revolution. And that for me is really interesting because in the literature on revolutions worldwide, since the 1980s, right, since the end of the Cold War, the two predominant models of revolutionary transitions have been the negotiated, peaceful, intra-elite transition that was attempted during that sort of 1988 to 1990 period, and which can be seen in many of the so-called velvet revolutions of Eastern and Central Europe at the end of the Cold War, but also ultimately during the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings from 2011 onwards in the Middle East and North Africa. Most of those ended up as negotiated transformations that kind of relied on sort of intra-elite negotiations and transitions of power that were predominantly non-violent. Then on the other hand, the sort of passive revolution, these kind of revolutions from above that are largely sort of directed by ruling classes with a view to buttressing their own ruling class power. Those are the other sort of major kind of, or sort of model of revolution that has attained worldwide since the end of the 1980s. And so this is what's really interesting, I think, about what's going on in Myanmar, in that both of those two models have been tried. Both of them have failed, predominantly because of the military. There are other sort of shortcomings as well. But what happened from 2021 onwards is that people in Myanmar learned the lessons, learned the shortcomings and the failures of those kinds of revolutions. And for the last 4 years have been showing how to do a revolution differently. And that's really distinctive because there are struggles elsewhere that would kind of benefit from that. This idea that the passive or the negotiated transformation are the only sort of possible routes to changing political orders is being fundamentally and completely challenged by the people of Myanmar and Myanmar's revolutionaries. And that's the sort of main story that I'm trying to explore in that paper. I think that it's something that hasn't been appropriately recognized by the wider sort of global audience. I think that people in Myanmar and people like us who keep a close eye on what's happening in Myanmar recognize that. But generally, it's something that is sort of kind of marginalized. People are concerned about what's going on in Ukraine. People are concerned about what's going on in Gaza, this is all understandable. But what that means is that we're kind of missing a very important story. We're missing a very important struggle that has implications for all of us, not just for people in Myanmar, but especially for people in Myanmar, but for people worldwide. And that's what I try and explore, I guess, in that very short paper in the space of 12,000 words.
Hmm. And so, like, you've opened up a lot of different areas of discussion here, and I'm going to try and sort of navigate them in a semi-structured fashion. But the first thing that comes up is that you're talking about all these different types of revolutions. I suppose we can discuss the typology of revolution, and you're talking about negotiated revolutions, passive revolutions, and I'm going to try and sort of quote directly from the paper here. So you're saying contemporary Marxist scholarship has tended to understand revolutions as defined by capitalism and imperialism, commonly deploying Gramsci's concept of passive revolution to explore processes of state formation, restructuring and expansion of capitalist social relations through bourgeois revolutions from above. And then you also go on to say the defining model since 1989, so obviously the break apart of the Eastern Bloc and the USSR, has been the negotiated revolution, less transformative with more modest goals, generally involving nonviolent transition through intra-elite pacts. And you come to the conclusion that the Myanmar revolution does not fit into either of those two categories. But you also note elsewhere that there is the category of the great or the social revolution, and you give as examples the French and the Russian revolutions, and you define it as driven by autonomous lower class revolts resulting in profound transformations of states and social relations. Or I should say perhaps Scott Paul defines it that way. Do you see the Myanmar revolution as fitting into that category of great or social revolution?
Yes, yeah, I do, absolutely. And that's kind of the sort of second aspect in which it, or the third aspect in which it can be seen as being redemptive. When it comes to these sort of negotiated and kind of passive models, a lot of the debate since 1989 has been about, well, do these negotiated transformations, do the revolutions of Central Eastern Europe, of kind of the Middle East and North Africa, do they actually consist in a revolution? Are they revolutionary changes of that society, or are they sort of simply a matter of reform? Right, sort of a transformation of in many cases sort of former Soviet bloc countries, kind of authoritarian regimes that aren't really sort of revolutionarily changing social relations, but instead what's happening is that there's this sort of reform to capitalist social relations, right? Protection for civil and political liberties, protection for sort of private property ownership, participation in the market, expansion of jobs and foreign investment. To what extent is that really revolutionary, and to what extent is that really a process of reform or sort of so-called catching up with the rest of the sort of liberal capitalist world? And so what you'll find is people talking about revolutions instead of revolutions, this idea that these are more reform than revolution. And there's been pushback, right? So people have said, well, it doesn't really capture the very real kind of revolutionary changes in society that have attained in those countries as a result of reform processes. I mean, Myanmar during the transition is a good example, right? People who kind of visited sort of Myanmar pre-2011, pre-2012, and then sort of visited again post sort of reform and opening, and you'll see that there are very real kind of social changes. And so there's debate over, like, can those sort of negotiated passive revolutionary transitions really be seen as sort of revolutionary if there isn't that sort of fundamental sort of upending transformation of social and economic hierarchies that we saw in, say, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, which are often sort of referred to as these sort of great social revolutions. Now, what's interesting is that many of those Arab uprisings, like Egypt, Tunisia, a lot of these uprisings started as kind of these subaltern, lower class revolts from below, right? Like everyone was in the square, kind of workers, professionals, people of all different social groups. But ultimately, the resolution of those revolutions was sort of through sort of intra-elite pacts and intra-elite transitions. What's interesting with Myanmar is that it also kind of started as this lower class subaltern revolt from below, from people who've been sort of left out of the political order. Right? It wasn't led by the NLD, it wasn't led by any one group in particular. It's this sort of organic uprising spurred by this shared rejection of the military seizing power in a coup once again, and people saying no to that, refusing to go back to the way things were prior to the transition. And so it started that way, and it's continued that way. I think when it comes to the role of political organizations like the NLD or the NUG or the CRPH, they play important roles, but the real driver of the revolution has been the people of Myanmar. The NUG and the CRPH and these other kind of political forces that are training to represent the people are kind of playing catch up. And they're not really the sort of sole leading kind of vanguard parties of the revolutionary forces. It's the people themselves. And what they're calling for is not just a return to the 2008 constitution, right? It's kind of a fundamental restructuring of the political order along sort of federal democratic lines, which makes it a political revolution, as many of these other sort of revolutions elsewhere, these negotiated transformations and these passive revolutions would also be considered political revolutions because they lead to transformations or kind of a replacement of the constitutional order. But what is very distinctive about Myanmar is that it's not just about replacing the political order, about a new constitution. It's about fundamentally upturning a whole range of different social inequalities and hierarchies, right? Gender-based divisions, kind of rejecting the patriarchy, refusing the sort of ethnic hierarchy of kind of national races. Across the board, there's sort of examples of these old social hierarchies, relations of domination and oppression that people are rejecting and overturning and insisting that the revolution follows through with them. And that, in my mind, although it's not a kind of a social revolution in the sense of being a sort of a social revolution in the way the Russian Revolution was, right? We're not sort of not going to see a sort of communist system, sort of fundamental reorientation of kind of the ownership of property relations being kind of challenged. It's not a communist revolution. But it is nevertheless a social revolution that's sort of seeking to upturn these other social class relations based on sort of gender and ethnic fractures and other sort of divisions within society, because there's this shared interest and determination to get rid of the military, to kind of overturn military Praetorian class rule that has relied on those other social class divisions and fractures. The military has relied on patriarchal relations, on religious distinctions, on ethnic divisions in order to sort of divide and rule. And so Myanmar, in my opinion, is one of these sort of, or potentially is one of these great social revolutions that goes beyond simply looking for the establishment of a new constitution to potentially being able to fundamentally restructure social relations in the country that are so that they're more equitable, that they kind of get rid of those old hierarchies and divisions and relations of oppression. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do, but if it's going to happen during a revolution. And I think there's very clear evidence of that happening in terms of what's now accepted and what's not, in terms of revolutionary forces, right? So if and when revolutionary forces are sort of trying to, or kind of engaged in acts that are considered to be sort of sexist or patriarchal or ethnically discriminatory, they come under a lot of criticism, and there's kind of pressure for them not to do that. Now, that's not kind of fixing that problem, but it does, I think, reflect the very real kind of transformation that has happened in Myanmar society since 2021, and before then, really, but since 2021, those voices that are opposing and rejecting those hierarchical relations and those cynical divisions that are kind of drawn and manipulated are being challenged increasingly.
So even while you're talking here, you're placing this emphasis on the revolution as a mechanism to improve, let's say very broadly speaking, systems, right? Whether that's the systems of political representation, whether that's the systems of, egalitarianism when it comes to sex and sexual identity and race and so on. And reading the article, there seems to be a very strong sense that I'm getting when I read it that there is an intrinsic legitimacy to be discussed here. With all of the examples of revolutions that you give and all of the typology of revolutions, it seems like it is assumed that a revolution's outcome or goal has to be an improvement of representation and expansion of the body politic, improvements in inclusivity across the nation. And simultaneously, at some point, I'm not sure whether I can find it, but you allude to the idea that a government has to be legitimized not only through internal structures within the state, but has to recognize that it as a government is subordinate to a higher moral principle, that it is that it exists for the benefit of the people. You even, as you were describing your typology, you mentioned Benjamin. And I even highlighted a quote that you put here from Benjamin. When the consciousness of the latent presence of violence in a legal institution disappears, the institution falls into decay. In our time, parliaments provide an example of this. They offer the familiar woeful spectacle because they have not remained conscious of the revolutionary forces to which they owe their existence. And it seems that there's this undercurrent when you're talking about these things, that governments have to understand that they are subordinate to the people, they are empowered by the people, and that revolutions have to exist in order to empower the people. So my fundamental question is, is that a part of the definition of revolution to you? Or can you consider let's say, a military coup that aims to fundamentally change the balance of power, fundamentally change the nature of the society, fundamentally change the nature of the institutions of the body politic, to also be a type of revolution?
Yeah, I mean, there's debate as to whether revolutions from above constitute revolutions. I mean, I'm in terms of my view on this, I think they certainly can, but if they're involved in the fundamental restructuring of the political system, if they're involved in trying to reorder social relations, whether it's from above or whether it's from below, that kind of constitutes a sort of a revolution. right? So from 1962 onwards, we've kind of seen there was this sort of attempted revolution from above that ultimately kind of failed in the 1980s. We saw a second attempt from the 1990s onwards to instigate or to kind of implement this sort of revolutionary or reorganization of Myanmar's political and social order by the military, by the institution of the military and senior generals. So, I mean, I certainly accept that those are revolutions, but they're revolutions from above that lack popular support and participation. What I'm calling Myanmar's, why I'm using this term redemptive revolution, is that what is distinctive about the Spring Revolution is that it's not a revolution from above. Yeah, it's not a passive revolution. It's not a negotiated transformation, or at least it isn't yet. There's a danger that it could deteriorate into that. Like if people decide that enough is enough and we're going to kind of reconcile with the military under pressure from China and neighboring states and perhaps the United Nations, there's a danger that it could become ultimately a revolution that's reconciled through that intra-elite transition. But what we've seen so far is that is unlikely to happen. And I don't think the people of Myanmar would allow that to happen. And that's what makes this distinctive as a revolution from below that seeks to redeem power to the people, right? To kind of use a sort of a bit of a cliche here. And that's this sort of other aspect that I'm using this term redemptive. I think that the potential of the revolution in terms of the sort of constitutional politics of what's happening at the moment in Myanmar is that in order to get rid of the military, not only have you had to have the establishment of these kind of parallel state structures and parallel institutions such as the CRPH, such as these sort of various organizations such as the sort of People's Assembly or the Federal Democracy Charter. Not only have you had to have the establishment of those parallel state structures, you've also had to have the establishment of these citizen militias, right? People's Defense Forces, local defense forces, as well as relying on ethnic armed organizations. And all of these things, political, military force, have been at least to some extent, oriented towards this revolutionary goal of getting rid of the military from Myanmar's political and social order. And that's redemptive in the sense that the only way to get rid of them is not through an elite transition, not through a negotiated transformation that kind of asks them to politely kind of step back from power and kind of go back to the barracks. Not give them this sort of position of oversight over the state that they had in 2011 to 2021. The only way to see the revolution through is to defeat them militarily. And the goal of that is obviously to replace the 2008 constitution with a federal democratic charter that is acceptable to kind of all revolutionary forces. And the significance of that is that it promises to redeem this idea of a political order being based upon the idea of popular sovereignty, right? Ultimately, where does ultimate power in political community lie? Who holds sovereignty in a state, right? We've got heads of state, presidents or monarchs or parliaments, different kind of forms of instituted power that claim to act on behalf or claim to exercise sovereignty. But ultimately, in most countries worldwide, not just liberal democracies, but also sort of post-revolutionary countries like China, right? They kind of all claim to derive the legitimacy of the exercise of power from a particular relationship that those institutions of constituted power have with people over whom they claim that legitimacy and that authority. And I mean, that's something that Myanmar's military has also claimed for itself as well. They've kind of claimed a role as sort of guardians of the nation. And
But I just want to ask on that. I'm glad you brought it up, but you specifically, this stood out to me when you wrote, the military imposes itself as successors to the monarchy deposed by the British, invoking supreme power to command based on the ideology of karmic kingship. Citation, George Adal, 2021. So I wonder, does that conflict with what you've just said? Does the military frame itself as deriving its power from the body politic and these political institutions, or does it frame itself or see itself as having absolute power by what we could call almost divine right?
That's a good question. I mean, what's happening during the revolutionary period is this sort of fundamental contestation over who has the right to exercise sovereign power in the country. This is something that the military have considered themselves to have, or have claimed for themselves for kind of generations. And it's something that, in terms of the sort of internal sort of ideology of the military, is sort of something that they sort of indirectly try to kind of claim that they're exercising it on behalf of the peoples of Myanmar, even though peoples of Myanmar don't really kind of recognize the legitimacy of them to do so. What's very clear, though, I think, is that revolutionary forces, people are rejecting that claim to legitimacy that the military are asserting, right? And can we see that very kind of clearly with kind of numerous acts of rebellion and resistance and contention for the last 3 years, and obviously much, much longer. So that kind of claim to be considered as sovereigns of the country is something that has never really held much purchase beyond those sort of socialized into that sort of military worldview. And it's something that others have kind of gone along with, I think, for long enough, basically just because the military are violent and are powerful and are quite happy to use that power and violence against people who kind of challenge them. But sort of power exerted through that kind of power of the gun doesn't constitute political legitimacy. And what's happening in the revolution is kind of a very clear repudiation of that claim and an attempt to build the institutions and to build a state that does accurately and legitimately claim power from people over whom that authority is supposed to be wielded. And that's why it's kind of redemptive. It kind of promises to redeem the power to people. It promises to kind of redeem this norm of sovereignty itself, right? This kind of norm of sovereignty. This has been a sort of structuring principle of the international, a structuring principle of the way that human beings organize political and social life on planet Earth for hundreds of years. And it means different things. Right? In one sense, you have kind of sovereignty understood in the sense of the power to command, the power to command point of a gun. In one sense, you have this understanding of Westphalian sovereignty as the sort of ultimate power within a particular territorial area, and the corresponding obligation on other actors to respect that sovereignty by not interfering in that in those so-called internal affairs of another sovereign state. So there are various kind of different meanings to this concept and this norm of sovereignty. But what we see in a revolutionary situation is a fundamental challenge to what that concept, what that norm actually means in practice, like through that crisis. And I think what we can see in Spring Revolution is this very different understanding of what sovereignty really means. And it's an expression of popular sovereignty, this idea that the people of Myanmar are rejecting the claims to legitimacy of the SAC, of the military, they're refusing to recognize their power to command. They think that, or they kind of criticize as misguided or kind of cynical these claims by, say, China, for instance, to not interfere in the internal affairs of a sovereign state, while at the same time continuing to interfere in the affairs of the sovereign state. So this kind of this norm that is often used in a way that's sort of quite unthinking, quite reflexive, and quite conservative manner is being fundamentally contested in the struggle over the state in Myanmar, and I think that's something that is very sort of inspiring, right, for kind of those of us who are living in countries that have established systems of government, established states that perhaps have sort of gone through revolutions hundreds of years ago. I'm English. We had the sort of glorious revolution in the 17th century. Americans had sort of the American Revolution in the 18th century. What I get frustrated with is this idea that when it comes to Myanmar, a country that was only sort of recognized as a sort of nation, as an independent nation state relatively recently, so 70 years ago, that the revolutionary processes that other countries, England, America, China, the revolutionary processes that those countries have gone through to establish these systems of government and these political orders that are now by and large kind of considered to be legitimate. And as much as I dislike Keir Starmer, I still kind of recognize that, okay, he is the Prime Minister, and yes, I'm a Republican, but King Charles, I'm not sort of going to go, I'm not going to sort of contest his claim to be the king, right? More than sort of a kind of a political opposition to that idea of a monarchical government. What those countries, the Chinese in particular, but like others as well, when they're looking at the revolution in Myanmar and sort of saying that, okay, well, this is all very messy and it's all very difficult, and people are using arms. There's kind of fighting going on. We don't really like that, because our job as sort of diplomats and representatives of the state is to kind of try and minimize armed conflict wherever it happens. What they're missing is that the very positions that they find themselves in, right, as parliamentarians, as representatives of the state, as sort of staffers in the diplomatic service, all of that is based upon revolutionary transformations that their countries and their states went through that were often violent, and have their origins in violence and are maintained with violence. And so that's what I'm trying to sort of get at there, in the sense that it really kind of pissed me off during September 2021, when you have all these kind of statements condemning the announcement of people's war against the military. It's like, oh, we condemn all sides. We call for all sides to refrain from violence. I mean, it's understandable, but I mean, it's kind of these are basically the sort of stale diplomatic tropes. But what I try and do in the argument is to kind of show how it's very cynical for them to do that, to kind of criticize revolutionaries in Myanmar from fighting for a political system that's grounded in popular sovereignty. Yeah, they're kind of fighting for something that most other people, most other representatives of states kind of take for granted for themselves. And yeah, I just kind of think that's incredibly cynical and needs to be called out.
And definitely, like the element of violence and non-violence is something that I'm very keen to get into, and I will in a bit, because I've highlighted a couple of sections, and I think we'll have a really interesting discussion there. But on the topic of sovereignty, still, I do find interesting. I've highlighted a few disparate components of what you've written here, so I'll I'll read it, but for the audience, be aware this is not one contiguous block of text. So you're citing Stephen Krasner here, and you're saying sovereignty has four distinct attributes. The first is international legal sovereignty in regards to international relations. The second is Westphalian sovereignty as the principle of non-interference. The third is domestic sovereignty as the ability of a state to maintain a monopoly on violence. And the last is interdependent sovereignty as a government's capacity to control intra-border movements. And in addition to being practically pernicious, the dominant framing, the emphasis, as you say, on the international legal sovereignty component, the dominant framing is conceptually shallow because it assumes sovereignty to be a property of a state. Krasner called this the, quote, principle of autonomy, a state's supposed freedom to do as it pleases within its territory, being the second attribute of sovereignty. This fetishizes the concept of sovereignty by treating it in abstraction from a social relation in which sovereign power is embedded. And you go on to say, interestingly, and deservedly, but a little bit heavy-handedly, although Myanmar's state has been formally sovereign since independence, it has never been sovereign eo ipso, and certainly not during the revolutionary period. Multiple ethnic rebellions and a nationwide revolutionary uprising have thwarted repeated attempts by the military to authorize itself as the authority and secure acquiescence of force. So this acquiescence by force, sorry. So this murderous cabal cannot legitimately claim sovereign rights as representatives of Myanmar. Quite a strong statement there. None of us are going to disagree with that. But what I find a very interesting question that has been opened here, and your position on this is clear, but I do think it bears discussing. At what point are we able to look at a sovereign state, which is to say, by these four categories that you outline here, a state that it has its contiguous territory, it has central authority, it has monopoly on force, it's internationally recognized, all those sort of typical Montevideo Convention style tests. At what point can we look at that state and say, those guys who are in charge and who occupy the capital and who functionally run the country, or at least the majority of the country, we don't think that they have sovereignty, we don't think that they have legitimacy. Is there some sort of objective, abstract litmus test that we can apply, or what is the system that we can use here?
Okay, it's, that does sort of veer into the polemical. I think I can share. In terms of what we're talking about, this part of the paper is kind of referring to debates about what sovereignty is. How do we understand this concept? Who holds it? And in the 1990s, early 2000s, there were kind of different views on this. There's kind of one view, which is basically sort of Krasner's perspective, is to try and sort of list these qualities that we associate with sovereignty, right? Kind of control over borders, sort of supreme authority, blah, 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 to kind of list these sort of four key characteristics of what we associate with this thing called sovereignty. In the 2000s, people were sort of saying, well, drawing on the sort of ideas of the German kind of legal theorist Carl Schmitt, can say sovereignty is about the declaration of either about the declaration of the state of war or the upholding the sort of the kind of saying that there's an exception to the Constitution pertaining in a particular situation. For instance, like when it came to somewhere like Guantanamo Bay, right, there's an expression of U.S. sovereign power to say that this was a sovereign territory, or this was a territory over which U.S. military forces exerted military power, but legally, U.S. Jurisdiction didn't reach to and cover detainees in Guantanamo Bay. And from that sort of essentialist understanding of sovereignty is about he who decides the exception. When does the constitutional order no longer apply? So within this debate, there were all these ways of either sort of listing qualities of sovereignty or boiling it down to this sort of brute exercise of power to decide the exception. Right? When does the law apply? When is the law superseded? And state of emergency, who declares a state of war. What a lot of that ignores is the so-called kind of routine politics of sovereignty. This is the idea that in most circumstances, right, for kind of 99% of the time, in most countries around the world, people just get along with their daily lives. They may not recognize the legitimacy of people who rule over them. They want different politicians or kind of a different government to be in place. They might want a different kind of political system. But by and large, they kind of acquiesce to what they have, right, 99% of the time. What happens in a revolutionary situation, what happens, and what's happening in Myanmar, is this sort of exceptional crisis situation where that kind of routine has been upended to such an extent that a huge number of people, we're talking millions of people, refuse to go on as they were and are willing to fight and to die and to make huge sacrifices to fundamentally restructure their social and political order at great personal and social cost to themselves. And it's those circumstances, it's those sort of periods of crisis, of revolutionary upheaval that I think kind of reveal a lot about who is sovereign and the nature of sovereignty in particular cases. And coming back to sort of the case of Myanmar, what's frustrating is that this very kind of sort of abstract and quite thin understanding of what sovereignty means. Either it means we're not going to interfere in the revolution. Everyone's interfering in the revolution. Right? The idea that the Myanmar's revolution is an internal affair of a sovereign state is completely absurd. Right? There's and this is a line that's repeated ad nauseum. Right? So we respect Myanmar's sovereignty. We kind of respect Myanmar's territorial integrity. Kind of respect the internal affairs of Myanmar as a sovereign nation. You'll find this in, yeah, it's you find it in bilateral statements after every kind of meeting. You find it in statements from the UN Security Council, like that everywhere. It's this understanding of what sovereignty is, but it's completely absurd. The revolution in Myanmar has roots from outside itself, not least the fact that the military itself was the product of colonial relations, British colonial relations and Japanese imperial relations. The fact that the military itself has been able to entrench itself so parasitically in the country as a result of its ability to trade, right? To kind of extract Myanmar's natural resources, jade, timber, oil, gas, labor, and kind of sell those to other countries. Right? One of the reasons why Myanmar's revolution is still ongoing is because, despite the fact that we've got a huge kind of civil disobedience campaign and refusal to pay taxes, is because the Myanmar military doesn't need people for its revenues. Right? It can get revenues from selling its gas to Thailand. It can get revenues from kind of manipulating the exchange rate when international organizations are kind of and companies are kind of bringing sort of money in or trying to get money out of the country. So all of these are sort of fundamentally international phenomena, right? And the fact that Myanmar Line and this kind of cabal of kind of senior military generals are so difficult to dislodge, despite the best efforts of people inside Myanmar, has like international aspects to it. There's international implications of the revolution. So these attempts of the fact that the military has been refusing to kind of renew visas and passports, and has been trying to kind of levy sort of extortionate taxes on kind of migrant workers overseas, that are then kind of putting those migrant workers to give up on this kind of idea of trying to be regular, or kind of discouraging them from trying to get that regular status, because it's going to support a military slaughtering its own people. And they're doing this from neighboring countries, in countries like Thailand, for instance. I mean, there's so many examples here of how the revolution is international all the way down. I mean, ultimately, it's going to be, it's either going to succeed or fail as a result of what happens in Myanmar, and the power and the strength of people of Myanmar, right? So it's kind of ultimately domestic and has to be resolved domestically. But to say that it's an internal affair of a sovereign state and we're not going to intervene, when you're inviting the SAC to summits in Kunming, when you're kind of when diplomats are presenting their credentials to them in Naypyidaw, when they're continuing to sort of buy oil and gas that's being produced from Myanmar's oil fields, and giving that money to under the control of the military. I mean, all of these things, it just kind of beggars belief how cynical and absurd it is to think about sovereignty in that way. And that's why I guess I'm so polemical in that part of the paper, because to me, what I see in the revolution is this incredibly significant, heroic, amazing sort of revolutionary uprising of 95% of the country, of kind of acts of bravery, sacrifice, hardship, of people trying to return power to the people, to establish a political order that has this kind of reflexive relationship between the state, the government, and people from whom it draws that kind of legitimacy and authority. And they're doing that in a way that is succeeding with minimal help, and in fact quite a lot of interference that assists the adversary, right, the SAC. And so that's what I'm trying to expose there, right? This idea that during a revolutionary situation over the last 3 years, that to kind of consider Min Aung Hlaing, to consider the SAC, to continue entreating with people who claim to be representatives of the state sitting in Naypyidaw, to continue to treat them as if they were representatives of a sovereign Myanmar, is fundamentally misguided and absurd. And instead, right, and this, there is an alternative, right? And instead, in order to kind of respect the sovereignty of the people of Myanmar, not only do you, or at a very minimum, need to withhold that recognition or interaction with those who have illegally usurped those positions and who are fundamentally challenged in their practice or their attempt to do so by the vast majority of the country. If you really want to respect the sovereignty of the country, well, you help the revolution to succeed, and to succeed as fast as it possibly can, with as little more trauma and death and destruction as possible. Yeah, you expedite that revolution in order for it to succeed and to establish a political order that finally, after generations of struggle, after numerous revolutions and uprisings, finally, belatedly, is able to kind of claim a form of legitimacy based upon a particular relationship between the governed and those who do the governing that has not been present in Myanmar since at least the colonial period, if not before. And
And
that's what's frustrating. I mean, we've got hundreds of years of struggle here that potentially could come to fruition. And international actors, right, diplomats, the United Nations, representatives of neighboring states, if these people should know better and need to be called out for failing to do what is really necessary, which is to kind of support the revolution and to kind of help the people of Myanmar see it through, to recognize that, I mean, this isn't just sort of an internal kind of conflict that has no resolution, or that is coming from nowhere, or that it's sort of motivated by private grievances, or doesn't have a sort of potential solution.
Because you provided your own sort of definition here. I mean, again, it's academic paper, so you're citing from others as well. But you've said sovereignty is the creative, formative power of a people to constitute the political forms of their own existence and to alter or abolish already constituted forms of political power once they become oppressive and alienated from their constituting origin. Accordingly, the referent object of sovereignty is not simply the state, but a state that exists in a particular relation to the community from which it draws its power and claims authority. Which, just to echo what you've just said there. So that's a pretty strong statement. That's a very bold statement. And I think definitely we're using that as our definition. 100%. The only way to support sovereignty in Myanmar sovereignty, the only possible way to do that is, as you've said, to expedite the revolution, to ensure that a genuine transformative revolutionary force comes into power, one which sees itself as empowered by the people and therefore subservient to the people and the body politic. But you also talk about the international element of it, and it just got me thinking, you look at a country like Thailand. Thailand is a monarchy. Now, I know you're a Republican, but there are countries in which the concept of sovereignty is very, very, very much not what you have outlined here, whether officially or de facto. And those countries seem to be very invested in the Myanmar revolution failing. What can be done here? It might be dangerous to say this, but would you say that certain countries that have a much more authoritarian grip on power have simply failed to meet the requirements of their sovereignty? Or are we saying that it has to be evaluated on a country by country basis? Myanmar is not set up to be an authoritarian dictatorship. Myanmar is not set up monarchically. Myanmar is not set up as a one party state. And therefore, in the case of Myanmar, we can say things should be done in a certain way. But then that leaves us in a situation where a state that operates the way that you've defined has to interact with states that might fundamentally reject this model of sovereignty and say, no, sovereignty has to derive from royal bloodline, has to derive from God, it has to derive from political abstract philosophy or from the one party or something along these lines. How do we reconcile these varied opinions internationally?
Yeah, so I mean that kind of quote that you kind of use from the paper, that's a good kind of definition of what I see sovereignty to mean. And the lesson I think that Myanmar is teaching to the world through the revolution is that is what sovereignty is about. Right? Sovereignty isn't about this kind of abstract power to command. It isn't simply about sort of control over sort of borders. Right? There's at a much deeper level, a much deeper conceptual and political level. Sovereignty is about this kind of reflexive relationship between a constituting power, a power from which constituted power draws its kind of legitimacy and its authority. Now, generally speaking, we kind of think that is the kind of people, right? It's the sort of understanding of popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty since, say, sort of the time of Jean-Jacques Rousseau is kind of about this idea that sovereignty doesn't sort of reside in the monarch. It's sort of something that resides in the people. And the challenge of sort of popular sovereignty is how to reflect that in political institutions, forms of state that we create. Now, when it comes to other countries, like Thailand, for example, I don't think there's anything particularly controversial about that conception of sovereignty that I outlined there. This idea that sovereignty is about this kind of reflexive relationship between people who claim to hold it and the people from whom they feel they get that legitimacy from. I mean, even in a monarchy like Thailand, monarchists will sort of say that the monarch is the father of the nation, and the monarch kind of reigns as a father in the interests of his subjects. Whether or not you believe that, whether or not you contest that, is something different, and I think it's kind of a different question. And I mean, if you look at the kind of youth protests in Thailand in 2019, I think it was, or 20, what you'd have seen there was not sort of simply this rejection or this challenge to the monarchy with no alternative. Right? What you would have seen from a lot of the student groups, like Thammasat, for instance, was an alternative vision of the nation of Thailand, from which the Thai state would or possibly could claim its authority and its legitimacy. And they sort of went back to the 1932 People's Revolution in Thailand to kind of tell this sort of different historical narrative to the historical narrative that the monarchists will kind of give about sort of the monarch as the father of the nation. Right? These are different stories that kind of different social factions have that claim to make sense and to give meaning to political systems that different people inhabit. Now, the difference is that for all that opposition that we saw in Thailand, and there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Bangkok and other cities nationwide, for all that sort of opposition and that demand or that desire for a different ground of legitimacy for the state that was more democratic, that was more inclusive, that was based on a different understanding of the nation. I mean, that uprising, those protests, as powerful and as threatening as they were to the monarchists at the time, they have petered out. I mean, they're still there, and there's still big divisions in Thai society between people who support or people who kind of who would go along with that sort of monarchist view, and others who would challenge it. But you don't have this revolutionary situation in Thailand like you do in Myanmar. And so, I mean, it's sort of this subterranean conflict that hasn't gone away. It will come back. It hasn't been resolved. Hopefully, it'll get resolved in a way that doesn't require or doesn't sort of end up in the kind of sort of violent confrontation that you have in Myanmar. And honestly, I don't think it will end up in that sort of violent confrontation that you see in Myanmar for many reasons, but the most important one being you don't have the ethnic armed organizations in Thailand as you do in Myanmar, without whom the revolution wouldn't be possible. Right? So that's not what's happening in Myanmar isn't going to happen in Thailand. But the lesson that Myanmar teaches us is that ultimately that's what sovereignty is about, and that is revealed through these crisis situations, and a revolutionary situation is this period of crisis, and it's a period of kind of opportunity, right? It's a period of threat, particularly to those in power, but also to those who are risking and sacrificing in the interest of kind of seeing it through. But it's also an opportunity to kind of fundamentally change the political order, to kind of change society. And that is what is so frustrating about these responses, is that nobody kind of really sees the opportunity that is being presented by the revolution in Myanmar. Right? It's kind of seen as a problem to solve, or to kind of even, probably not to solve, but a problem to ignore, to kind of palm off on somebody else and hope that it will sort of resolve itself on its own. We'll sort of do our best, but ultimately we're not going to fix it, and people inside Myanmar fix it. So it's kind of seen as this. It's a thorn in the side of ASEAN. It's a thorn in the side of liberal democratic and so-called liberal democratic states. Nobody really recognizes it for the opportunity that it is. It's kind of what I would consider to be a world historic opportunity of establishing a political order that is fully sort of emancipatory. Right? It's kind of, it would be the completion of generations of struggle. It would see sort of seeing the back of this irredeemable military, this kind of military that is unacceptable to the majority of people in Myanmar and to anybody outside of Myanmar who hears about it. There's a kind of very clear opportunity here that is difficult to seize, and nobody really wants to sort of stick their head on the line, which means that those structures of international politics, the United Nations system, bilateral engagements, ASEAN, I mean, these are all really dead ends. For me, the sort of best hope for the revolution to succeed has got nothing to do with what are essentially kind of conservative and sort of reactionary forces from neighboring countries and kind of well-wishing onlookers who don't really have like a huge national interest in seeing the revolution succeed. And it's in the sort of power of the revolutionaries themselves and people who stand in solidarity with them, kind of who help them fundraise, who kind of support people who are supporting humanitarian systems, a range of different kind of exercises and practices of international solidarity below and across state levels. That is where I think the sort of opportunity can be seized. Yeah.
So I even want to like sort of go above what you said, because you said that it seems like people are not seeing the potential in the revolution, but I would say that the truth is probably significantly worse than that, which is that there are many state actors who do see the potential of the Myanmar revolution, see it as a potential for undermining their own regimes and their own very sort of tenuous grips on power within their own states, and are therefore actively working against the revolution. Would you say that if the Myanmar revolution succeeds, that is going to have ramifications internationally for countries that have previously just expected that, you know, a sovereign status quo does not need to be predicated on genuinely engaging with the body politic? It can be predicated on ideology, it can be predicated just on history, or it can be predicated on monopoly over the means of violence.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a sense in which it suits neighboring countries, particularly China and Thailand, for there to be a sort of relatively underdeveloped country next door, in the sense that they can kind of extract resources. They can have a relatively sort of pliant political system through kickbacks and sort of bungs and giving the right people construction contracts for building economic corridors and mega infrastructure projects. There are certainly sort of some parts of some neighboring states that would be quite happy with things continuing as they are. But that's not necessarily true for all of those states, right? There are some. I mean, in Thailand, for instance, there's many parts of Thai political society, Thai elites, who would see a sort of a developed or a developing Myanmar as much more in their interest. Right? There was a lot of business going on during the transition. There was investment. There was a lot of trade. The same with the Chinese. They would rather have a stable Myanmar than an unstable Myanmar. So while there are kind of parts of those states or kind of actors within some states that would capitalize on being able to have a sort of relatively predatory relationship to the country, I think it's probably an oversimplification to say that, say, a particular state would prefer that to be the case. Russia perhaps is the kind of clear outlier here. I think given the fact that they've completely thrown their hat in with the SAC, I think they probably recognize that, well, if and when it falls, that kind of relatively limited interests in the country might not be there for very long. But honestly, I think that most countries just don't have the interest or the capacity to try and sway it one way or other. With the possible exception of the Chinese, right, in kind of recent weeks. So like this week, we've sort of seen the reports of the house arrest of the MNDAA kind of leader, pressuring them to withdraw from Lashio and kind of give it over to the SAC. There's certain kind of instances in which kind of Thai authorities will sort of respond to requests from people, from the kind of security forces in Myanmar and kind of crack down. But by and large, like these are the exception rather than the rule. These countries aren't really that interested in what's going on in Myanmar, and it's more a matter of negligence than sort of willful sort of destruction, I think.
Okay. I want to move to the issue of violence and non-violence, because this is something that's kind of interesting. You state early on in the paper that unarmed protests have been the predominant form of revolutionary mobilization since 1989, and the general expectation is that successful and normatively justifiable revolutions will continue to be non-violent. But at the same time, you also note significantly further down that violence has been the sine qua non of revolutions for centuries. The efficacy of non-violent resistance has declined propitiously since its peak at the turn of the millennium. So there seem to be two contradicting factors here. The one being that, as you're saying, violence is necessary. It's not just inherent to, but is necessary to the success of a revolution, but also that there seems to be a recent norm that revolutions have to be nonviolent in order to be granted legitimacy by outside observers, and that this is an expectation that is continuing despite the fact that it is increasingly obvious that nonviolent resistance is simply not effective. What is your take on this seeming contradiction?
So my position is basically that any political order, right, any state, is ultimately fundamentally dependent on violence for its continued existence, right? Whether that's kind of an armed forces, military, an army to sort of defend itself, whether it's the threat of sort of latent threat of violence against people who break the law and sort of kind of imprisoned to kind of dissuade people from kind of breaking the law. Every kind of political order, every state is ultimately resting on violence. We kind of see that in the sovereign right to declare war, for instance, is kind of a very kind of clear and obvious example of that. And yeah, as you kind of mentioned from the piece, in the history of revolutions, like most revolutions have been violent or have necessarily kind of entailed armed struggle and kind of sort of violent confrontation between between competing sides. The point that was being made there is that I think that there's this short-sightedness amongst liberals in particular when it comes to the efficacy of nonviolence in revolutionary struggles. Right? There's this sort of celebration of nonviolence as somehow sort of superior, as kind of as sort of equal in kind of power to that of sort of violent struggle, and this kind of desire to eliminate violence from revolutionary struggle. And that's understandable. Right? Kind of revolutionary violence is horrific, and it kind of has terrible consequences that are sort of unanticipated. It can make things worse rather than better. And the dynamics of the so-called velvet revolutions of the Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War that sort of demonstrated the power of mass mobilization, of kind of the force of numbers, of the effectiveness of non-violent strategies, kind of strikes, non-compliance, mass marches, protests, sit-ins, like all sorts of kind of non-violent strategies that have proliferated from these transformative struggles, not just sort of revolutionary ones, but also things like the civil rights movement in the United States. There's a very important and normatively desirable kind of point that's being made here, in that like violent revolution isn't the only way to achieve progressive political objectives, and kind of non-violent struggle is powerful as well, and in many cases is preferable. And if we can uphold this sort of absolute commitment to non-violence and achieve our ends, then great. That's the sort of preference. That's sort of something that we should do. But the point that I'm making is that I think that the experience of revolutions in the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, where these mass non-violent struggles have been successful, hasn't just been because they've been non-violent, right? There are other conditions that enabled the success of those non-violent revolutions. For instance, right, in kind of Central and Eastern Europe, you had the Soviet Union collapsing. So the sort of authoritarian kind of states weren't able to kind of find support and assistance internationally. And they were under a lot of pressure from the kind of the West not to use violence. I think there was also conditions that sort of included the sort of loss of willingness of kind of security forces to use violence against this many people. Right, there was this kind of restraint amongst sort of police and armies. We can see that those are the conditions that need to be there for non-violent struggles to be successful. Right, there needs to be intense international pressure for the revolution to be concluded in a way that's ultimately non-violent. And there also needs to be domestic conditions, including this, and very importantly, this kind of reluctance of security forces to turn guns on their own people. Now, that's not absolute. I mean, in many cases, I mean, Bangladesh most recently, security forces will shoot and kill their people. But there comes a point at which they're like, no, this is enough, and we're not willing to keep on doing this. The problem in Myanmar is that point is never reached by the military. Right? They're more than happy to kind of slaughter people, to gun people down in the streets. Yes, there are cases of defections, and there are cases of kind of people from within the military who have refused to do that, or who have ultimately kind of taken very considerable risks to themselves and their families because they refuse to. But institutionally, in Myanmar, that condition of elite restraint that enables the success of these non-violent revolutionary struggles elsewhere. Yeah, most recently in Bangladesh, but also in places across sort of Middle East and North Africa during the Arab Spring and Eastern and Central Europe. That condition of elite restraint is not present in Myanmar. And what that means is that non-violent strategies are an important part of the struggle, but they are not a sufficient. They're not sufficient for that struggle to succeed. They're not sufficient to engage in self-defense. They're not sufficient to see the revolution through when you have an armed forces, like the armed forces that you have in Myanmar, who ultimately have very few qualms about exercising violence against people in their own country because they've been doing it for generations. It's what they're sort of brought up into as members of the military. And they're very happy to do it against people who they see as sort of challenging that kind of power. So that's the point that I'm making there, is that yes, non-violence is kind of preferable, but it depends on certain conditions being in place for it to be effective. And since the turn of the millennium, across the world, authoritarian regimes have sort of responded to these new non-violent strategies with kind of various different ways. I mean, we were kind of talking about sort of Thailand recently. Now, in the recent protests, Thailand's security forces were remarkably restrained. I mean, they did use they did use kind of violent methods against protesters, including rubber bullets and kind of sort of water cannons, but they haven't sort of slaughtered people in the streets. And the strategies that they use instead were to kind of use these modern technologies, using things like Pegasus spyware from sort of Israel. They were using kind of legal techniques of sort of trying to kind of decapitate the movements in those other kind of more sophisticated ways, because they realized that using violence would be counterproductive. The military in Myanmar, for whatever reason, were not that smart. And the kind of orgy of violence that you saw in March 2021, rather than kind of scaring people into submission, just kind of galvanized this kind of resolve to kind of get rid of this pernicious force in the country once and for all. So I mean, that's the point that I'm making, is that we would all prefer for it to be a non-violent revolution, but that completely ignores the sort of opponent that these non-violent protesters are up against. And what then sort of annoys me is this kind of liberal conceit amongst international observers who were fascinated and sort of celebrated these amazing protests we saw across the country.
Okay. So what I find interesting on the question of violence is, we're talking about conventional forms of violence, but you mentioned even specifically the civil rights movement in the United States. And there's a tract that I'd like to read here from Kwame Ture. And what he says is, the way the oppressor tries to stop the oppressed from using violence as a means to attain liberation is to raise ethical or moral questions about violence. I want to state emphatically here that violence in any society is neither moral nor is it ethical. It is neither right nor is it wrong. It is simply a question of who has the power to legalize violence. It's not a question of whether it is right to kill or wrong to kill. Killing goes on. Let me give an example. If I were in Vietnam, if I killed 30 yellow people who were pointed out to be by white Americans as my enemy, I would be given a medal. I would become a hero. I would have killed America's enemy, but America's enemy is not my enemy. If I were to kill 30 white policemen in Washington, D.C., who have been brutalizing my people and who are my enemy, I would get the electric chair. It is simply a question of who has the power to legalize violence. In Vietnam, our violence is legalized by white America. In Washington, D.C., my violence is not legalized because Africans living in Washington, D.C. do not have the power to legalize their violence. And it goes on to say, is it not violent for a child to go to bed hungry in the richest country in the world? I think that is violent. But that type of violence is so institutionalized that it becomes a part of our way of life. Not only do we accept poverty, we even find it normal. And that again is because the oppressor makes his violence a part of the functioning society. But the violence of the oppressed becomes disruptive. It is disruptive to the ruling circles of a given society. And because it is disruptive, it is therefore very easy to recognize. And therefore, it becomes the target of all those who, in fact, do not want to change the society. What we want to do for our people, the oppressed, is to begin to legitimize violence in their minds so that for us, violence against the oppressor will be expedient. This is very important because we have been brainwashed into accepting questions of moral judgment when violence is used against the oppressor. So I think there is a very important question there. If anyone is interested, by the way, that tract comes from an essay called The Pitfalls of Liberalism, written by Kwame Ture in 1969. That tract, I think, opens this discussion into what does and does not constitute violence, because if we look at Myanmar in a state where the people are perpetually terrified and petrified of the military, not because the military actually delivers violence to them, but because the quality of their lives is so poor and so miserable under a corrupt and abusive regime that extracts value from the people while delivering nothing. Does that not then rise to the same level of violence? And should it not then trigger the same level of indignation as you get when the people decide to take up arms and fight back against the government? Because you said in your article, the NUG's endorsement of armed struggle alongside nonviolent resistance further complicated its quest for international recognition and made it harder to access foreign assistance. Why does there seem to be this double standard?
Okay, so a couple of things. I mean, I sort of appreciate that quote that you're sharing, but my initial reaction to that is that I think it's probably a little bit too permissive when it comes to the permissibility of violence. The case that he uses, like sort of American violence against the Vietnamese, just because it's legalized doesn't mean it's morally justified. So I would prefer to have sort of a stricter adherence to non-violence than that. That kind of excerpt suggests. I think it's a bit too permissive. And the argument that I make is that a commitment to non-violence is normatively justified and something that we should try to uphold. But at the same time, we need to recognize that that commitment is not absolute. That there are conditions on that commitment to non-violence, and that we can make exceptions to that normal commitment to non-violence. The problem with that quote is that there isn't that sort of pre-expectation of a commitment to non-violence. It's like, well, whatever goes, so long as it's legal. I'd kind of reject that. Now, in the case of Myanmar, I think that those conditions of sort of exceptional circumstances apply, right? Not just in terms of self-defense, right, which can clearly required in response to the crackdowns beginning in February and sort of culminating and sort of reaching a sort of a crescendo in March 2021. It's clear that sort of violence is an appropriate response to violence as a matter of self-defense. The other point that I'm making is that revolutionary violence, in the sense of being deployed to the ends of establishing a legitimate political order, of overturning a political order that is fundamentally illegitimate and rejected and is violent and is abusive. But in those circumstances, it's not up to me to decide whether or not it is appropriate to sort of withhold that, or to kind of suspend that normally sort of absolute commitment to non-violence. It's up to the people of Myanmar, and they've clearly made that decision themselves. Right? There's massive support. I mean, not only kind of people fleeing and kind of traveling to regions where they can get military training to fight back, but also the kind of huge nationwide public support for PDS, for LDS, for ethnic armed organizations. But it's very clear that the people of Myanmar have sort of decided that kind of a normal commitment to non-violence that would pertain in non-revolutionary situations is not something that they are committed to during this revolutionary period. But it's something that people were committed to in the 88 uprising. Yeah, and that commitment, that absolute commitment, was one of the reasons why it didn't succeed. And so there's been this kind of commitment to absolute non-violence in the past that has been ultimately a handicap, not just in Myanmar, but also during the Arab uprisings in the Arab Spring, right? Sort of absolute commitment to non-violence in places like sort of Syria. I mean, this absolute commitment to non-violence became a handicap, and they were sort of dealing with these kind of hyper-oppressive regimes that were willing to use violence against them, just going to get slaughtered. So that's the point that I'm making, is that generally this commitment to non-violence is good, and it's something that I'm not contesting, but that it's not absolute.
Mm-hmm.
It's not absolute when it comes to the condition of self-defense. And it's not absolute in a revolutionary situation when it's necessary to establish or to kind of necessary to kind of establish a new political order, to exercise the sovereignty that people are claiming for themselves and taking from, or kind of refusing to kind of recognize the sovereignty or the claim to sovereignty made by the military, and kind of taking for themselves. And in order to take it for themselves, they need to use techniques of armed struggle alongside non-violent strategies. So I think that's a very different approach to the role of violence in the Spring Revolution to the picture that the Toure quote was suggesting, which I think is a bit too permissive. Like I think it should be clear that normally in normal situations, like an adherence to non-violence is good, but that it can be withheld or withdrawn in those conditions that I sort of outlined. And again, that it's not up to me to decide whether or not those conditions are met. That's a decision for the people of Myanmar to take, and I'm not going to criticize them for taking it. I understand their decision to take to kind of make that decision, and I support it. What kind of frustrates me is that I think it's a very clear situation in which that exception to this normal adherence to principles of nonviolence is a kind of very clear situation in which that exception applies. But still, international actors are like saying that they condemn all sides, right, and kind of call on all sides to refuse violence. And again, I think this is it's not surprising. I'm not shocked that this is this kind of response that they are coming back with. But I think that the job of intelligent people, I think observers that have an interest in what they consider to be the right thing, should call it out as hypocrisy, call it out as bullshit. And that's what I try and do.
Absolutely, but I do kind of wonder, like, what are the criteria that you're applying here? Because you stated very clearly just now that what determines what should be done and how it should be done is the will of the people. That it is the course of action is appropriate because the people of Myanmar have decided collectively that the application of violence in this instance is appropriate. Whereas my personal approach would be much more to say, well, it doesn't really concern me overly whether the people themselves view it as appropriate. What concerns me is whether or not the application of violence is objectively expedient. Whether, for example, we can minimize losses long-term, lives lost long-term, through the application of violence in the short term. And it's a very ugly mathematics to have to do. We look at World War II history, United Kingdom, you look at the Coventry problem. Do you allow Coventry to burn in order to protect the fact that you've cracked the Enigma code? You look at, dropping the nuclear weapons on Japan. Horrific, terrible thing to do, but does it, speed up the end of the war? Does it save lives in the long run? And it's a terrible mathematics to have to do. But that seems to me a more objective and universal approach. You seem to take the approach that the permissibility, possibly we could go so far as to say the morality of violence is determined by a collective group. and it doesn't have to adhere to any objective, universal criteria or principles. Is that correct?
No, not really. So what I write in the paper is that it's up to individuals to kind of wrestle um, with that decision themselves. Right? I mean, it's not an easy decision to make. Um, if you're willing to sort of kill another person on a battlefield, I'm not sort of saying that that's a decision that is to be taken sort of collectively as a group. I mean, who exactly is going to do that? What I'm saying is that in a situation like a revolutionary situation in Myanmar, where all other avenues for self-defense, for opening the space for politics, right? Like non-violent strategies require there to be an open political space, like at least relatively open. But when you're kind of facing an adversary that will not even allow the tiniest sort of political space to open, because they are going to shoot you in the head in the streets, or they're going to kind of arrest you from your bed in the middle of the night and torture you, or they're gonna sort of drop bombs on this kind of school or the hospital that you're sort of sheltering in. I mean, if there's no space for that non-violent political action to occur, then in order to kind of open that political space, so long as there's a reasonable chance of success, which I think there is in the case of Myanmar, so long as it's considered to be sort of proportionate or whatever, like, come back to these principles of just war, it's discriminatory and the like, not just sort of efficacious, then I think that there's circumstances in which individuals can make that decision for themselves. Now, yeah, I think there's also an important role for institutions, right? So the MUG, CRP8, for ethnic organizations, for military command structures, also to kind of take in ensuring those kind of criteria of necessity, proportionality, discrimination, legality are all sort of met. But ultimately, the decision of whether to use violence or not comes down to the individual who has to live with it, who has to wrestle with their own conscience. So yeah, I'm not sort of saying it's this kind of group decision. I'm saying that it's an individual one that's subject to these sort of institutional oversights, constraints, safeguards or whatever, without kind of sounding too much like a liberal on it.
It's interesting because I wanted to just throw out the hypothetical of, what if you had a system, a regime, in which you are not faced with violence? You won't be shot on the streets for protesting. No one's going to do those sorts of things to you. But there is no political space. You don't get to vote. There is no democratic system. There's no parliament for you to vote in. And you can agitate and you can protest for change, but no one in power actually listens to you and nobody cares. You're not going to be shot. You're not going to be beaten. You're not going to be arrested. Those things won't happen to you, but you are powerless politically. In that kind of a situation, what would you say? Is it incumbent on people to try and seek political solutions to those problems because they are not themselves facing violence? Or is the fact that there is no political space now opening up that question for the individual to say, maybe violence is my only recourse? Or would you just say it really still just has to come down to that individual to decide?
Yeah, good question and tough one, because what you're doing there is kind of basically kind of taking away that kind of criteria of necessity for self-defense from that calculation, which makes it very easy, I think, to kind of say that it can be sort of justifiably sort of upheld, that sort of principle of absolute commitment to non-violence. In that kind of hypothetical, I mean, I hate dealing with hypotheticals because hypotheticals simply don't exist, and I wouldn't know what the sort of context was, and you need to understand a context in order to make a judgment about particular sort of actions or responses. So I'd kind of I'd resist sort of being put into that hypothetical, but I guess for consistency, yeah. So in that sort of hypothetical situation, I guess to be consistent with the sort of reasoning that I use in the paper. I think that it would be up to the individual in that situation to decide whether or not it would be necessary or not. I think that being able to make that decision in the abstract without taking into consideration the kind of concrete circumstances in which the decision is being made is sort of a little bit meaningless. And coming back to the situation in Myanmar, I think that's what makes it such an obvious decision there. Right? We've got kind of generations of struggle, and the possibility that those generations of struggle could be cashed out, could be have their sort of ends and their aspirations realized. Which means that in that context, that this commitment to nonviolence, if people want to remain committed to nonviolence, then that's fine. I wouldn't sort of challenge that personal decision to remain committed to it. But equally, I wouldn't criticize anyone who's taken the decision the other way, that on balance, given the horrors that they've faced, given the generations of oppression, given the nature of the adversary, that the sort of otherwise commitment to nonviolence can be sort of ignored in that context.
And yet, the issue that we're faced with is that in the Myanmar situation, where you and I and all of our listeners will agree that there is a pressing need for self-defense. I know many of our listeners are very very fundamentally opposed to violence through Buddhism, but we would all agree that there is a pressing need for some form of self-defense and that there is a presence of oppressive violence. However, the international community, as you're noting in the article, is very, very, very reticent to ever co-sign this. And as you say, this equivocating bullshit of, well, we call on both sides to de-escalate and to abstain from violence, knowing full well what they know, which is that the violence up until now has been very one-sided and has been beyond the pale. What seems to underpin this obsession? Why is there this fear on the part of governments and polities that are not themselves directly engaged in the revolution to say, I hereby co-sign violence in order to protect moral precepts? And simultaneously, there seems to be a very high degree of comfort in hiding behind the notion of sovereignty, saying, I can co-sign violence that is being carried out by the due monopolizer of violent force within a sovereign polity. What is this? Is this that governments want to protect that principle in case they themselves would like to use violence at some point in the future? Or do they just not want to be seen as warmongers? Like, what is the disconnect here?
I think it's very simple, in the sense that when people are acting on behalf of a state, like when we're kind of talking about heads of state or diplomats or kind of representatives or whomever, the role that they have is essentially to kind of sort of maintain the status quo. They're very kind of small c conservatives. Any challenges to the status quo, any challenges to existing relations of power, whether that's sort of domestically within a state or kind of internationally or kind of through a revolutionary challenge. I mean, this is something that unsettles them, that is seen as dangerous and potentially leading to chaos and instability. And ultimately, what they're concerned with is managing the sort of balance of power between superpowers. Ultimately, what they're concerned with is upholding order, trying to minimize violence, trying to enhance kind of trade, trying to project norms of legitimacy to kind of, these are what they're really concerned with. They're not really concerned with the freedom of the people of Myanmar, which is why when it comes to kind of scholars, when it comes to sort of academics or kind of people who are studying this, like that's the job of people like me, I kind of hope, is to take a different perspective on this, right? And I'm as I said in my introduction, my background is in international theory, international relations, and there's sort of three traditions in sort of IR when it comes to thinking about international politics. First is obviously the sort of realist position that emphasizes power, national interest. Another is the so-called kind of international society position that is interested in upholding order. But the tradition that I'm interested in, and I draw upon, is the sort of so-called critical tradition of international relations that tries to approach questions of war and peace, trade and investment, kind of struggles like the revolutionary struggle in Myanmar, not from the perspective of power or order, but from the perspective of emancipation. Like what does it take, or an understanding of what's going on in Myanmar look like if we are concerned not with managing the balance of power between the US and China, not concerned primarily with kind of upholding the sort of Westphalian system of particular understanding of sovereignty in ASEAN, and that those sort of conservative approaches to these problems of the international, of which revolutions and war are kind of the two central ones. But what does it mean to approach our scholarship of and our understanding of these phenomena from the perspective of human liberation? And that is what I try and do with that kind of paper when it comes to exploring Myanmar. I think that there's so much analysis of the revolution out there from think tanks, from kind of other scholars that sort of take a kind of a sort of a positivistic kind of bias, this idea that we have to be kind of objective and neutral, and kind of premise or kind of be very kind of clear on the facts, or take a very sort of cautious approach to our analysis. I mean, there's so much of that kind of scholarship and analysis of the revolution out there, and I think it's the job of critical scholarship to challenge that, not to kind of say that it's fundamentally wrong or it's misguided, to say that it only kind of captures part of the picture. And that's kind of a theme that I try and develop with the revolution, right? This is this idea that, I mean, there's so much analysis that kind of deploys these old tropes of Myanmar, right? Kind of frames the revolution as sort of a revolution that's happening in the country that has been subject to the longest civil war, right? That's kind of one that you see in newspaper articles frequently, where you kind of often see these kind of mentions of Aung San Suu Kyi as a fallen human rights icon. There's kind of all these kind of condescending takes about the kind of chances of the revolution succeeding, and this was initially what I kind of began sort of writing that paper in response to. I mean, all of these kind of pieces that frame the revolution in those ways, that kind of rely on those kind of stale old tropes, lead into these kind of analyses that present Myanmar as this sort of intractable conflict, right? The inevitability of kind of state failure, right? They kind of emphasize these kind of centrifugal forces that are kind of ripping the country apart, rather than these kind of centripetal forces that are bringing the country together in the revolution. The dangers of fragmentation. I mean, all of these kind of analyses they're not empirically wrong, right? They have facts to back them up. They can claim to be sort of objective and neutral, but they're also kind of politically debilitating, right? They kind of have a mode of thinking that kind of reinforces a sense of hopelessness and a resigned cynicism, and a sense of hopelessness and resigned cynicism that kind of finds a welcome audience in kind of state officials, right? They're quite happy to be told that this is a conflict that isn't going to be fixed, because it means that they have less obligation to do something about it, or to kind of to intervene in one way or another.
Mm.
And so I think that against that, what I see is that sort of fundamental sort of methodological pessimism that kind of feeds this almost sort of cynical realism about the conflict. I think what I'm trying to do with my paper is to kind of approach the revolution from this perspective of liberation, using sort of a kind of a methodological optimism, trying to kind of see that yes, it's tragic, and yes, there's hardship, and yes, it's obscene what was happening in Myanmar, but it's also very hopeful. The lessons that people from Myanmar are teaching us about the strength of mass collective action, about the ability to oppose this kind of hyper oppressive and violent regime, and to stand a good chance of toppling it and establishing a federal democratic state that people have been struggling for generations. That's a remarkably optimistic, or that's a remarkably inspiring story if we look at it with that emphasis on sort of what's becoming, what's kind of in motion, what could be, if it gets the necessary support. So I mean, that's what I'm trying to kind of achieve there is to kind of not to confront head on that sort of pessimistic analysis that identifies the shortcomings and the failings and the possibility that the revolution may fail and it might not succeed. I'm not sort of saying any of those analyses are wrong. What I'm trying to do is to kind of complement those forms of analysis to build a better rounded picture that I hope does sort of justice to what people in Myanmar kind of feel is an important part of the revolution that perhaps isn't necessarily recognized very well by outsiders so far.
And so that paper, again, for those who are interested, that's Myanmar's Redemptive Revolution, Constituent Power and the Struggle for Sovereignty in the Nueu Spring Revolution, which is published in the European Journal of Foreign Relations, I believe. I'm conscious of your time. So before we go, the last thing that we always do in our episodes is to just open the floor to you as the guest to share any direct message you might have to our audience, any message that you might want to give them or any thoughts that you want them to consider as they go about their day. So if there is anything that comes up, and I know we've covered quite a bit of ground today, but if there is anything that you think people should know or that people should consider and think about, I would invite you to share that with them now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, right? Because what I'm trying to do is kind of say that this kind of what I'm exploring in that paper is basically what I've been taught by the people of Myanmar. Right? I'm not sure how much I have to teach them, and what I'm trying to do is to kind of communicate what I see as some of these kind of bigger lessons that I'm getting from these heroic, incredible achievements that kind of people in the country have kind of have realized over the last 4 years, and do my best in whatever kind of way that I can to kind of lend some support and solidarity from afar to doing that. So I kind of feel a bit awkward to be put on the spot to say that there's something that I would have to share with them. The only thing that I do have that sort of sits in the back of my mind and kind of gnaws away a little bit is I do kind of worry that what comes after the revolution. I don't think this is being adequately addressed by people in the revolution because, understandably, they're concerned with the task at hand, which is defending themselves from the military and kind of getting rid of the military. But the revolution doesn't end with the military being defeated. The revolution would only end with the sort of realization of the aspirations that drove it originally. Right? Those aspirations, not just for a new constitution, but those aspirations for a fundamentally more equal society, overcoming those social, ethnic, religious, generational class cleavages. And I just hope with sort of all my all my power, that is something that can be followed through on, because once the military starts collapsing, as I believe it will eventually, it's a question of when, unless there's sort of a lifeline that's sort of thrown to it. Um, Once that starts happening, things will move very, very quickly, and vultures will circle, and um, sort of domestic and international elites and sort of well wishers and carpetbaggers and the like will sort of descend and try to uh, tell Myanmar what they need to do. And there's a danger of it kind of being sort of another one of these kind of truncated transitions, right? These sort of revolutions that sort of succeed in ousting a regime, but fail in the sense of realizing the sort of aspirations that drove them. And for me, that is most pronounced, I guess, when it comes to the question of the people who have perhaps suffered the most during the revolution, right? The sort of farmers in the plains, right? People who've lost homes and houses and loved ones. It was the sort of farmers and kind of the sort of poorer workers and industrial workers during the transition that sort of really weren't weren't particularly well looked after by the government of the sort of the NLD kind of period. I think that when it comes to thinking about what comes after the revolution, the big challenge, perhaps not as difficult as sort of dealing with the military, but also as significant is kind of how to kind of follow through on those aspirations to kind of realize a more sort of fair and equitable society beyond simply replacing that constitution in a way that sort of gives all of those groups that have had the sort of least ability to withstand these attacks, these kind of economic shocks and the like, how to kind of look after them at the end.
I'll be honest, not only is asking for donations my least favorite thing in the world to do, I find it pretty uncomfortable as well. Yet, it is an unavoidable but necessary task in order to ensure that our platform can continue to bring you stories from post-coup Myanmar. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that there is a basic minimum cost to keep our engine humming. So please allow me to take a moment for that least favorite and uncomfortable thing to do, and ask sincerely for your generosity in supporting our mission. If you found value in today's show and think others might as well, we ask that you take a moment to consider supporting our work. Thank you for taking the time to hear our spiel. And with that, it's off to work on the next episode. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam poda yaranam